I found a site claiming it can control chaos, and the more you read, the worse it gets. This is the ACDCA Part 2.
In the previous video, we came across a website called the ACDCA. This stands for Applied Chaos Dynamics Control Association. The first document is Politics and the Myth of Choice. The earliest document sets up the foundational critique with a deceptively simple opening image. Parking ticket. Engelberg uses it to distinguish between genuine politics, which operate not through force but through symbolism. It reframes what politics actually does. Rather than a mechanism for citizens to express preferences, politics functions like a thermostat. It both reads the temperature of the public mood and adjusts it, simultaneously reflecting and shaping what people believe is possible. The self-reinforcing nature of this dynamic is the key insight as citizens orient their thinking around political symbols, parties, candidates, slogans. Those symbols come to define the outer boundaries of acceptable thought. Ideas that challenge the underlying assumptions of the symbolic order aren't refuted. They simply fail to register as valid. The system doesn't need suppressed dissent because dissent that doesn't speak the language of the prevailing order is effectively invisible. On voting, Engelberg makes a point that cuts sharply against conventional civic wisdom. Politicians actually benefit from low turnout because it narrows the range of attitudes they need to manage. A smaller, more ideologically consistent electorate is easier to address with targeted symbolic appeals. The disaffected majority, those who don't vote, are not outside the system. They are governed by it as subjects rather than citizens. Authority neither accepted nor rejected, it is simply a fact. The most striking practical proposal is the wire incandidacy tactic. Rather than boycott elections, Engelberg proposes flooding them with self-votes, each disaffected voter writing in their own name to create what he calls a numerical black hole in the results. The idea is not to win, but produce a statistically visible anomaly that media and politicians cannot easily spin. 5% of the popular vote in a federal election qualifies a party for federal matching funds, giving the tactic a concrete statutory target that moves it from symbolic gesture to legal mechanism. The document was written at the height of the Occupy movement, and that context is everywhere in its pages. It is grappling with exactly the question Occupy couldn't answer. How do you convert diffuse, synchronized disconduct into organized action without being absorbed back into the party system you're trying to escape? The second one, After the War, published deliberately on Independence Day. This is the most historically detailed pamphlets and the most deliberately provocative. Its central claim, drawn heavily from Charles Byrd's 1913 economic analysis of the Constitution, is that the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was essentially an insider trading scheme, and that underlying this is the prerequisite for understanding everything else about American political life. The numbers are specific. Roughly 40 of the 55 delegates held depreciated war bonds whose value would dramatically increase under a strong federal government capable of honoring them at face value. Not one delegate could be said to represent the interests of the laboring majority, the farmers, renters, and wage workers who made up most of the population and had largely financed the revolution. The founders' explicit anti-democratic views are quoted at length, not as incidental opinions, but as design specifications. Hamilton, speaking at the convention on June 18, 1787, argued that nothing but a permanent body can check the imprudence of democracy. Madison warned in the Federalist No. 10, democracies have never been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of the property. Engelberg's point is that these weren't the private reservations of a few nervous aristocrats. They were instead rationale for the system structure. Hamilton's financing plan is the document's centerpiece. Once the new Constitution was ratified by the men who stood to profit from it, Hamilton, as Treasury Secretary, arranged for the national debt, now owed to those same speculators, to be paid off at full face value in gold coin. The funding mechanism was the whiskey tax, levied against the subsistence farmers who had sold their war bonds to speculators at loss of 80 or 90 cents on the dollar and who now paid a again to honor those same bonds at full value. Endelberg's summary is blunt. Capitalists wealthy enough to risk speculation on the ultimate outcome of the Revolutionary War bought up depreciated war bonds from soldiers and farmers for pennies on the dollar, overthrew the standing government under the Articles of Confederation, paid themselves off in full with gold coin, and then funded the payoff by taxing the working classes. Jefferson himself, on learning the full details of Hamilton's plan after returning from France, described it as the deepest regret of his political life, writing that he had been duped into forwarding schemes not then sufficiently understood by me. Madison, writing to Jefferson in 1791, described the scheme as a mere scramble for so much public plunder. The document ends with two graphs placed side by side: rising value of slave stock in the United States between 1805 and 1860, and the rising manufacturing output per worker from 1947 to 2009. The visual argument is that, adjusted for inflation, median wages have remained essentially flat since the mid-1960s, while productivity has more than doubled. This relationship between labor and its returns is structurally comparable to the relationship between slave and owner. As John Taylor observes in 1814, the profit made by those called freemen greatly exceeds what is generally made by those who are called slaves. The third entry, in spring 2016, is Report on Debt and Wages in Public Education, written by Menchem Bailey, PhD, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The only document in the archive not written by Endelberg is also the most data-driven and locally grounded, using the University of Wisconsin system as a concrete case study for what the other pamphlets describe in philosophical terms. Bailey's contribution to the archive is specificity, real budget figures, real legislative history, a named memo, a named institution. The opening numbers establish the scale of the shift. In 1980, UW-Milwaukee received over 60% of its funding from state tax revenue. By 2014, that figure had fallen below 20%. Enrollment grew over the same period. The gap was filled not by efficiency gains, but by tuition, paid increasingly through student loans bearing interest. Bailey's sharpest analytical move is to name this as deliberate rather than accidental. Cuts made in the name of efficiency that structurally require students to borrow at interest are not efficiency measures. Quote, paying more for what could cost less is decidedly inefficient. End quote. The state now spends more on prisons than on higher education. The Powell Memo section is the document's most explosive. 1 week after Nixon froze wages and withdrew from the Bretton Woods gold standard in August 1971, corporate lawyer Lewis Powell sent the U.S. Chamber of Commerce a confidential memo titled, quote, Attack of the American Free Enterprise System, end quote. Powell's alarm was specific. Criticism of capitalism was coming not from fringe radicals, but from, quote, perfectly respectable elements of society, end quote, particularly University Social Science Facility, whose research was, quote, supported by tax funds generated largely from American business. His prescription was systematic and long range. Place ideological aligned scholars in universities to evaluate textbooks, monitor television networks, and build coordinated national funding capacity. Strength lies in organization, in careful long-range planning and implementation, in consistency of action over an indefinite period of years. Bailey's point is that the defunding of public education that looks like fiscal conservatism is in fact a 50-year implementation of deliberate strategic plan. The Jacobs framework gives the document its theoretical backbone. Jacobs identified two fundamentally incompatible moral systems: the guardian syndrome, which governs mission-driven institutions through hierarchy, loyalty, tradition, and the rejection of commerce, and the commercial syndrome, which governs markets through voluntary exchange, honesty, competition, and contract. Both systems are legitimate and necessary, but they cannot be mixed. When guardian institutions adopt commercial ethics, virtues invert into vices. Trading favors in public office become bribery, loyalty becomes conspiracy, conspiracy becomes tyranny. Bailey applies this directly to the university. A public institution that thinks in terms of revenue and market position is not becoming more efficient. It is becoming corrupt in Jacob's precise technical sense. The back cover states the human cost with quiet fury. The typical American today works, quote, not at the threat of violence, but of hunger. Bankruptcy from the treatable illness, trapped in a crippling spiritual vacuum where at best the meaning of life is a new car every few years. The white-collar middle class, Bailey notes, is a soon-to-be disposable demographic born of bureaucratic control, and therefore without any cultural traditions of organized resistance. The fourth one, published in 2016 through 2017, is An Archaeology of Human Captivity by Ambrose Nemopoulos, the most philosophically ambitious document in the archive, and the most unusual in its framing. Dated in Anno Lumina rather than the Common Era, attributes to a pen name rather than Endelberg, and ranging across Marx, Borges, the Talmud, Freemasonry, Buddhist art history, and the CIA's venture capital arm in a single sustained argument, where the other pamphlets diagnose specific systems. This one asks why those systems exist at all. What mythology makes industrial exploitation feel natural and inevitable? The central provocation is deceptively simple. Is human superiority over animals as obvious as assumed? Nemopoulos works through this not as an animal rights argument, but as a lens for examining property, conquest, and the ideology of progress. If what humans distinctively possess, language, technology, religion, and the capacity for organized violence, is also what enables systematic destruction of conditions for life on Earth, it becomes unclear in what sense these capabilities represent an advantage. Quote, perhaps we are a massive genetic fluke, a mistake, most people lacking in some vital regulatory mechanism that nearly all other organisms seem to possess. The Abrahamic conquest theology is identified as the ideology root of both capitalism and technological progress, the belief that the world exists to be subdued, that growth is inherently virtuous, and that a technological solution to every problem is forthcoming if we wait long enough. Nemopoulos traces this from Genesis through the Roman Empire's absorption of Christianity, through the Italian Renaissance and the Enlightenment, to its secular formation as myth of progress. Quote, an empire of statistics, a bureaucratized, industrial, state-sponsored myth. End quote. Planned obsolescence is described as battlefield attrition, institutionalized as manufacturing growth imperative. The most striking passage brings together the CIA's own chief security officer, Dan Geer of NQTEL, speaking at the 2014 RSA conference about the impossibility of maintaining a coherent identity under pervasive surveillance. The same Geer who appears in Citizen Revised. His advice on misrepresentation, paying therapists in cash, swapping affinity cards with like-minded strangers, using Tor for no reason at all, maintaining multiple digital identities, is presented not as paranoia but as rational response to a system that has made identity itself a mechanism of control. The practical conclusion echoes all the other pamphlets while grounding it in something older. Quote, the conquest of the world can be substituted with the conquest of the self. End quote. The Gnostic tradition, Augustine's interpretation of the apocalypse as an internal rather than external event. Buddhist, non-attachment. These are not offered as spiritual consolations, but as alternative organizational principles. If the self, the world, and the divine are significantly co-equal, then systematic exploitation of the world is a form of self-harm. The document ends, characteristically for the archive, not with a political program, but with a behavioral suggestion. Eat less meat, use mass transit, reduce consumption, not as an individual virtue, but as recognition that the mythology driving industrial civilization cannot be described as progress, but as honest measure. The final document, in 2018, is Citizen Revised, the most carefully argued of all the pamphlets, and the most directly shaped by its moment, written 5 years after the Snowden revelations, with full knowledge of what the NSA's Utah data centers represented, what PRISM collects, and what JTRIG does. It is also the most historically grounded in positive tradition rather than a critical one, tracing the concepts of anonymity from medieval European cities to the American founders to argue that surveillance doesn't merely threaten privacy, it dissolves the preconditions for citizenship itself. The key analytical move is the separation of two concepts that are routinely conflated. Anonymity means impossible to identify. Privacy means impossible to observe. A cash purchase in a cafe is anonymous but not private. It happens in a public view. A doctor's visit is private but not anonymous. The physician knows the patient intimately. Modern surveillance attacks both simultaneously by different mechanisms, and conflating them makes it harder to understand what is actually being lost. The historical section on anonymity is the pamphlet's most original contribution. Medieval European cities grew around fortified encampments, and the surrounding commercial suburbs attracted laborers fleeing feudal estates. When a serf arrived in a city claiming free status, there was no one form for their home estate to deny the claim. After a year of anonymous urban residence, they were granted legal citizenship. Anonymity was not a side effect of the city life. It was the legal mechanism by which the feudal order was dismantled and the concept of citizenship created. Engelberg traces this forward through the Federalist Papers, published that formal equity before the law requires treating citizens as abstractly identical, which requires a degree of anonymity to the present moment, where the erosion of anonymity is nothing less than a form of social engineering. The surveillance history draws on the Church Committee's 14 volumes documenting COINTELPRO operations, anonymous poison pen letters designed to break up marriages, the FBI helping establish a new Ku Klux Klan as a provocation, mail opening on mass industrial scale. Engelberg's argument is that the current apparatus, PRISM, X-Keyscore, Fox Acid, JTRIG, represents the same programs put online, streamlined, and partially automated, now operating under legal cover rather than in violation of the law. The FISA court's secret 2013 ruling that built collection of all American phone records was relevant to terrorism investigation is presented as the key institutional hinge. What was once illegal is now mandated, and what was mandated was authorized in secret by a court that meets in secret, hears only one side, and whose rulings are classified. Practical conclusion is the most sober in the archive. There is no technical solutions. Organizing on a wiretap means surrendering the element of surprise. Sun Tzu's most basic strategic principle: 3 people who all switch off their phones at the same moment produce a correlated metadata event that signals they didn't want to be heard together. The only meaningful response is behavioral. Organize in person, pay cash, use Linux, fragment your digital identity deliberately. As Dan Geer put in RSA 2014, in the passage Engelberg quotes, "Misrepresentation means hiding in plain sight when there is nowhere else to hide." The final image is Kafka's parable. The problem with our laws. Our laws are not generally known, but they are kept secret by a small group of nobles who rule us. End quote. Secret laws administered by secret courts issuing secret rulings undermine principle of consent of the governed at its root, not by violating the Constitution, but by redefining its terms in private. The sphere of citizenship, Engelberg concludes, quote, once expanded to be more inclusive and participatory, now it's rapidly becoming unrecognizable. End quote. Okay, that is all I'm going to cover on the ACDCA. If you like this video, sub to the channel and leave a like. This is a new channel, so I will be trying to get exposure, and I will be doing a lot more in-depth dives like this. Thank you.